The coffee shop on Pine Street had become my refuge every Tuesday morning, a small sanctuary where I could pretend my phone wasn't buzzing with another passive-aggressive text from my brother Daniel. I stirred my latte and watched the foam swirl, trying to ignore the latest message that flashed across my screen. Dad's medical bills won't pay themselves, Maya. Some of us actually care about family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Working as a night shift nurse at Riverside General wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and kept me busy enough to avoid most family gatherings. That's exactly how I preferred it. My scrubs bore coffee stains, and my hair perpetually escaped whatever ponytail I'd hastily thrown it into. But I took pride in my work. Saving lives felt more meaningful than the corporate ladder Daniel climbed with such determination. He'd made his feelings about my career choice abundantly clear at last year's Thanksgiving dinner. "Maya's still playing dress-up nurse," he'd announced to the table, his wife Christina giggling beside him. "While the rest of us build real careers, she's stuck wiping down hospital beds for minimum wage." The assumption that I earned minimum wage was just one of many misconceptions my family held about my life, but I'd learned long ago that correcting them only invited more ridicule. Daniel lived in a sprawling house in Willowbuck Estates, drove a Tesla that he leased but couldn't quite afford, and worked in pharmaceutical sales where he'd somehow convinced himself he was saving the world by pushing overpriced medications to desperate doctors. His Instagram was a carefully curated collection of expensive dinners, weekend getaways, and motivational quotes about success. My social media presence consisted of photos of my elderly cat, Mr. Whiskers, and the occasional sunset from the hospital parking lot. The pressure had intensified since Dad's stroke 6 months ago. What started as concerned family check-ins had evolved into a systematic campaign to extract money from the one person they assumed had the least to lose. Daniel's messages arrived like clockwork, each one wrapped in concern but dripping with entitlement. "Mom can't handle the stress of Dad's care costs. You should contribute more since you don't have a mortgage or kids to worry about." The truth was more complicated than Daniel knew. I did have a mortgage on a modest townhouse in the Arts District that I'd bought with the insurance payout from Aunt Rose's death 3 years ago. Aunt Rose had been the family eccentric, a woman who'd never married, traveled extensively, and lived in what my mother called shameful independence. She'd left me her entire estate, much to everyone's surprise and Daniel's barely concealed resentment. "Why would she leave everything to Maya?" I'd overheard him complaining to our mother. "I'm the one with a family to support, with real responsibilities. Maya just works her little nursing job and lives alone with that cat. What's she going to do with Rose's money anyway?" What I'd done was exactly what Aunt Rose had taught me during our long conversations over her kitchen table. I'd invested it, quietly, methodically, and without fanfare. Rose had been a brilliant woman who'd made her fortune in real estate and stock investments decades before anyone took women in finance seriously. She'd shared her knowledge with me not because I was the favorite, but because I was the only one who listened when she talked about compound interest and market volatility instead of asking when she'd settle down and have children. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a group text that included my mother, Daniel, and his wife. "Family meeting tonight at 7. Dad's care facility wants to discuss payment options. Maya, you need to be there. No excuses this time." I finished my latte and headed to my car, a 10-year-old Honda Civic that ran perfectly well despite Daniel's constant comments about my rust bucket. The morning shift change at the hospital was always chaotic, but I'd requested to come in early for a meeting with Human Resources about a promotion opportunity. The nursing supervisor position had opened up, and after 8 years of night shifts, I was ready for regular hours and the substantial pay increase that came with management. The promotion would mean a salary that was nearly double what my family assumed I made, but I hadn't mentioned it to anyone. Aunt Rose's voice echoed in my memory. "Never let them know your full worth until you're ready to use it, dear. People will either underestimate you or try to take advantage. Sometimes both." Dr. Patricia Chen, the head of nursing, smiled when I knocked on her office door. "Maya, come in. I have excellent news about your application." The conversation that followed was everything I'd hoped for. The position was mine, effective immediately, with a starting salary that would push my annual income well into 6 figures. I'd also be eligible for the hospital's executive investment program, which would allow me to purchase shares in the medical center at a significant discount. As I walked through the hospital corridors, greeting colleagues and checking on patients from the previous shift, I felt the familiar satisfaction of work well done. This was my world, where my skills mattered and my value was recognized. It stood in stark contrast to family dinners where I was treated like the charity case who needed their pity and guidance. The afternoon passed quickly as I wrapped up paperwork and prepared for the transition to my new role. My phone remained mercifully quiet until about 4 o'clock, when Daniel called instead of texting. His voice carried that particular tone he used when he was about to deliver what he considered a reality check. "Maya, I hope you're taking tonight's meeting seriously. Mom and I have been looking at Dad's finances and the situation is worse than we thought. The care facility wants a substantial deposit, and insurance isn't covering everything. We need to discuss how the family can contribute, and that includes you stepping up in a real way." I listened to his monologue about responsibility and sacrifice, about how everyone needed to do their part during this difficult time. He painted a picture of himself as the responsible son carrying an unfair burden while his selfish sister lived carefree and childless, hoarding her modest nursing salary while her family suffered. "Daniel," I interrupted gently, "I've been contributing to Dad's care since the beginning."
That $50 a month you send Mom doesn't count, Maya. We're talking about real money here, adult responsibilities. Maybe it's time you considered selling Rose's house and using that money for something that actually matters. The suggestion hit me like ice water. Aunt Rose's house had been sold years ago, and Daniel knew it. But he assumed the modest sum it had generated was sitting in a savings account somewhere, earning minimal interest while I lived paycheck to paycheck. He had no idea that I'd taken Rose's advice and parlayed that initial inheritance into something far more substantial through careful investing and aggressive saving. "I'll see you tonight," I said simply, ending the call before he could continue his lecture about family obligations and financial responsibility. As my shift ended and I drove toward my parents' house in the suburbs, I thought about the meeting with my financial advisor scheduled for tomorrow morning. Jennifer Walsh had been managing my investment portfolio for 2 years, helping me navigate the complex world of stock options, bonds, and real estate investments that Aunt Rose had introduced me to. Our quarterly meetings had become something I looked forward to, a chance to see how my careful planning and discipline were paying off. Tomorrow's meeting was special, though. Jennifer had called last week to schedule extra time, mentioning that there were significant updates to discuss regarding my portfolio's performance. The crypto investments that Rose had encouraged me to make early, before most people understood digital currency, had apparently performed beyond everyone's expectations. My real estate holdings, including the rental properties I'd quietly acquired over the past 3 years, were generating substantial passive income that my family knew nothing about. Walking up the familiar driveway to my childhood home, I steeled myself for what I knew would be an uncomfortable evening. Daniel's BMW sat prominently in the driveway, polished and pristine, a symbol of success that he wore like armor against his own insecurities. My Honda looked humble beside it, which was exactly the impression I'd cultivated for years. The house smelled like my mother's anxiety cooking, a sure sign that she'd been stress baking all afternoon in preparation for difficult conversations. Daniel was already seated at the dining room table with Christina, their expressions serious and slightly martyred, as if they were preparing to deliver news of a terminal diagnosis rather than discuss care options for our father. My mother emerged from the kitchen, her smile tight with worry. "Maya, thank goodness you're here. We have so much to discuss, and Daniel has prepared some options for us to consider." As I took my seat across from my brother, I noticed the folder of documents he'd prepared, the spreadsheets outlining costs and payment plans, the assumption of leadership that he'd appointed himself. This was Daniel's element, the corporate presentation of family crisis, complete with charts and projections that painted him as the rational problem solver and everyone else as supporting characters in his drama. I settled into my chair and waited for the performance to begin, knowing that by tomorrow afternoon, everything would be different. Jennifer's portfolio updates would change the entire dynamic of our family, but tonight I was still just Maya the nurse, living paycheck to paycheck and dependent on her family's guidance. Daniel opened his folder with the gravity of a surgeon beginning a complex operation, ready to explain to his simple sister why she needed to sacrifice her modest security for the good of the family. If only he knew what Aunt Rose had really taught me about the power of patience and the value of letting people underestimate you until the moment you choose to show them exactly who you've become. Daniel cleared his throat and spread the papers across the table, like a general mapping out a military campaign. I've done extensive research into Dad's care options, and I need everyone to understand the gravity of our situation. His presentation voice was in full force, the same tone he probably used to convince doctors to prescribe his company's latest arthritis medication to unsuspecting patients. The first document showed monthly care costs that made my mother gasp audibly. The second outlined what insurance would and wouldn't cover. The third was Daniel's proposed family contribution chart, with my name at the bottom assigned a monthly payment that represented nearly a third of what he assumed I earned as a night nurse. As you can see, Daniel continued, his finger tracing down the columns of numbers, everyone needs to step up proportionally. Christina and I are already stretched thin with our mortgage and the kids' private school tuition, but we're prepared to contribute $1,500 monthly. Mom, you'll use Dad's pension and Social Security, plus we'll need you to tap into that CD account for the initial deposit. He paused dramatically before turning his attention to me. Maya, I've calculated what you can afford based on your salary range and minimal living expenses. Since you don't have dependents or significant financial obligations, you'll contribute $800 monthly. Plus, we need you to access whatever's left from Aunt Rose's estate for the upfront costs. The silence stretched across the dining room while I processed his assumptions. $800 monthly would represent a significant sacrifice if I actually earned what he thought I did. The demand for Rose's inheritance money was particularly galling, considering he had no idea what had happened to those funds or how they'd grown over the past 3 years. Christina nodded supportively at her husband's presentation. Daniel's been working so hard to figure this all out. We really need everyone to commit tonight so we can move forward with Dad's placement tomorrow. My mother twisted her wedding ring, a nervous habit that had intensified since Dad's stroke. Maya, honey, I know this is a lot to ask, but Daniel's right about your situation being more flexible than ours. You don't have children to consider or a big house payment. The assumption that my life was somehow less valuable because I'd chosen independence over traditional milestones had always been a family theme. My career was a phase compared to Daniel's real job. My townhouse was a starter home, while his McMansion represented true success. My contentment with being unmarried was settling, while Christina's dependence on Daniel was admirable partnership. I understand Dad needs care, I said carefully, but these numbers seem quite high. Have you looked into all available programs and financial assistance options? Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. Maya, I've spent weeks researching this. I'm not some amateur throwing around random figures. This is what quality care costs, and Dad deserves the best facility available. What he didn't mention was that the facility he'd chosen was the most expensive in a 3-county area, with amenities that rivaled luxury hotels rather than focusing purely on medical care. I'd researched the same options during my lunch breaks, finding several excellent facilities that would provide identical medical treatment at substantially lower costs. There's also Sunset Manor, I suggested gently. Their medical ratings are identical, and the monthly cost is about 40% lower. Absolutely not, Daniel's response was immediate and sharp.
Dad's not going to some cut-rate warehouse just so you can avoid stepping up financially. This is about dignity and respect, concepts you might understand better if you'd ever been responsible for anyone other than yourself. The attack stung, particularly because it dismissed years of caring for critically ill patients who trusted me with their lives daily. But I'd learned to absorb Daniel's verbal jabs without responding, a skill that had served me well in both family dynamics and high-stress medical situations. Christina placed a supportive hand on Daniel's arm. What Daniel means is that we all want the best for Dad. Maybe Maya just needs time to adjust her budget and see how she can make this work. The condescension was breathtaking. They were discussing my financial capacity as if I were a child who needed guidance managing my allowance, rather than a healthcare professional who'd been financially independent for nearly a decade. My phone buzzed discreetly with a text from Jennifer Walsh. Excited about tomorrow's meeting. Your portfolio performance this quarter exceeded our most optimistic projections. We'll have a lot to celebrate. The irony wasn't lost on me. While my family debated my ability to contribute $800 monthly to Dad's care, my investment portfolio had apparently generated more passive income in the past 3 months than Daniel earned in his entire annual salary. The meeting dragged on for another hour, with Daniel presenting additional scenarios and contingency plans that all centered around the same assumption. Maya was the weakest financial link who needed to be pressured into maximum contribution. My mother occasionally attempted to soften his approach, but ultimately supported his conclusions about my obligations and capabilities. As the evening concluded, Daniel handed me a printed summary of my assigned contributions, along with bank routing information for transferring the upfront deposit. I need confirmation by Friday that you can access Rose's money. We can't move forward with Dad's placement until all funding is secured. I folded the papers carefully and slipped them into my purse. I'll review everything and get back to you after I meet with my financial advisor tomorrow. The statement hung in the air like an unexpected plot twist. Daniel's eyebrows shot up with barely concealed amusement. Your financial advisor? Maya, you don't need to pay someone to tell you to put your money in a savings account. That's just throwing away money you could be contributing to Dad's care. Christina giggled softly. Oh, Maya, those free consultations at banks aren't real financial planning. They're just trying to sell you credit cards and checking accounts. The assumption that I would only have access to free bank consultations rather than professional wealth management services was perfectly consistent with their overall assessment of my financial sophistication. In their minds, I was someone who needed guidance on basic budgeting, not someone who required complex investment strategies and tax planning. Nevertheless, I said evenly, I always consult professionals before making major financial decisions. Daniel shook his head with the patronizing smile he reserved for what he considered my most naive moments. Maya, this isn't some complicated investment decision. This is family responsibility. But fine, talk to whoever you want. Just remember that Dad's care can't wait for you to feel comfortable with basic math. The drive home gave me time to process the evening's dynamics and prepare mentally for tomorrow's meeting with Jennifer. My family had revealed their true assessment of my worth and capabilities, assumptions that had been building for years but never stated so explicitly. To them, I was a financial lightweight, playing dress-up in an adult world, someone whose modest contributions should be accompanied by gratitude for being included in important family decisions. My townhouse felt like a sanctuary after the oppressive atmosphere of assumed incompetence and manufactured urgency. Mr. Whiskers greeted me with his usual dignified indifference, more interested in his evening treats than my family drama. I poured a glass of wine and settled into my reading chair, reviewing the materials Daniel had prepared alongside my own research. The morning arrived gray and drizzly, perfect weather for what I anticipated would be a transformative day. Jennifer's office occupied the top floor of the Meridian Financial Building downtown, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river and the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted about success. Jennifer Walsh was a woman in her early 50s who'd built her reputation managing portfolios for healthcare professionals and other high-income earners who valued discretion over flashy displays of wealth. She'd been recommended by Aunt Rosa's attorney 3 years ago, and our working relationship had evolved into mutual respect and carefully calculated financial growth. Maya, you look well, Jennifer smiled as her assistant brought coffee and pastries. I hope you're prepared for some exciting news about your investments. The portfolio review that followed exceeded even my optimistic expectations. The cryptocurrency investments that Rose had encouraged me to make in 2021 had multiplied by factors that seemed almost fictional. My real estate holdings, including the 3 rental properties I'd quietly acquired over the past 2 years, were generating monthly passive income that exceeded Daniel's take-home pay from pharmaceutical sales. Your total liquid assets now exceed $1.2 million, Jennifer said, her tone professional but pleased. The rental income alone generates approximately $4,000 monthly, and that's before we factor in the appreciation value of the properties themselves. She spread additional documents across her mahogany desk, each one representing different aspects of my financial portfolio that my family couldn't begin to imagine. Stock options that had vested and multiplied, municipal bonds that provided tax-free income, a diversified international portfolio that hedged against domestic market volatility.
But here's the really exciting development, Jennifer continued, pulling out a folder marked with the logo of Riverside General Hospital. The executive investment program you qualified for last week includes the opportunity to purchase shares in the medical center at a significant discount. Given your new position and your existing relationship with the institution, I'd recommend a substantial investment. The numbers she presented were staggering. The medical center was expanding into 3 new facilities over the next 5 years, with projected returns that would make my current portfolio look modest by comparison. My promotion to nursing supervisor hadn't just increased my salary, it had opened doors to investment opportunities typically reserved for physicians and hospital administrators.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. If you proceed with this investment, Jennifer explained, you'll essentially become a part owner of the medical center where you work. The quarterly dividends alone would generate enough passive income to cover any family obligations you might have, several times over. As she spoke, I thought about last night's meeting and Daniel's carefully calculated contribution chart. He'd assigned me a monthly payment that represented what he considered a significant sacrifice from my assumed poverty-level existence. In reality, that same amount represented less than what my investments generated in weekly passive income. Jennifer's presentation continued with projections and scenarios that painted a picture of financial security that extended far beyond anything my family could comprehend. I wasn't just financially stable, I was approaching genuine wealth through careful planning and the patient execution of Aunt Rose's investment philosophy. There is one consideration, Jennifer added thoughtfully. Given the size of your portfolio and the complexity of your holdings, you'll need to be more strategic about privacy and disclosure. Wealth at this level attracts attention, both wanted and unwanted. Her warning resonated with Rose's long-ago advice about keeping one's full capabilities private until the moment you chose to reveal them. My family's assumptions about my financial limitations had actually served as protection, allowing me to build substantial wealth without interference or demands. But Daniel's presentation last night had crossed a line, demanding access to Rose's inheritance and treating me like a financial dependent who needed his guidance to understand basic mathematics. The time for protecting their misconceptions was ending, and tomorrow would bring revelations that would fundamentally alter our family dynamics forever. As I drove back toward my parents' house for what I knew would be our final meeting as unequal participants, I thought about power and perception, about the assumptions people make when they can't imagine lives different from their own. Daniel had spent years treating me like his intellectually and financially inferior sister, never questioning whether his assumptions matched reality. Tomorrow, those assumptions would collide with documentation that would redefine everything they thought they knew about Maya the nurse who lived paycheck to paycheck with her cat in a modest townhouse. The revelation would be surgical in its precision and devastating in its completeness, delivered with the same calm professionalism I brought to medical emergencies. Jennifer had prepared a comprehensive portfolio summary that laid out every investment, every asset, every source of passive income that comprised my financial reality. As I pulled into my parents' driveways, I felt the weight of that folder in my briefcase, knowing it contained the power to reshape my family's dynamics forever. The next evening brought unseasonably warm weather, the kind of October night that felt like nature's final gift before winter settled in. I parked my Honda next to Daniel's BMW, noting how the setting sun caught the gleaming polish of his lease payment, while my reliable sedan sat unassumed beside it. The symbolism wasn't lost on me as I gathered my briefcase and prepared for what would undoubtedly be our most memorable family meeting. My mother answered the door with the same anxious smile she'd worn the night before, though something in her expression suggested Daniel had spent the day reinforcing his narrative about my financial obligations and limited understanding of family responsibility. "Maya, perfect timing. Daniel has prepared even more detailed information for you to review." The dining room table had been transformed into Daniel's command center, complete with color-coded folders, a laptop displaying spreadsheets, and what appeared to be a presentation remote. Christina sat in her designated supporting role, tablet in hand, ready to take notes on whatever decisions emerged from her husband's financial expertise. Maya, sit down. Daniel's tone carried the authority of someone who'd convinced himself he was conducting a business meeting rather than manipulating family dynamics. I've spent the entire day on the phone with the care facility, insurance representatives, and our attorney. The situation is more urgent than we discussed yesterday. His presentation began with updated facility costs that had mysteriously increased overnight, followed by insurance complications that required immediate family contributions to secure Dad's placement. The documents he spread across the table painted a picture of financial crisis that demanded swift action and total family commitment. The facility director called this morning, Daniel continued, his voice taking on the gravitas of someone delivering critical news. They have another family interested in Dad's room, and we need to provide a deposit by tomorrow afternoon or lose the placement entirely. The artificial urgency was textbook manipulation, designed to prevent careful consideration or alternative research. I'd seen similar tactics used by pharmaceutical companies when pushing doctors to prescribe new medications without thoroughly reviewing clinical data. Christina nodded seriously at her husband's fabricated timeline. It's so stressful when these medical decisions can't wait for everyone to feel completely comfortable with the financial commitment. The implication that my hesitation stemmed from comfort rather than prudence was perfectly calibrated to position me as selfish and unrealistic. In Daniel's constructed narrative, family members who needed time to review major financial decisions were obstacles to proper care, rather than responsible adults exercising reasonable caution. Maya, I need a firm commitment tonight, Daniel announced, producing a document that resembled a legal contract. I've prepared an agreement that outlines each family member's monthly contributions and timeline for accessing available funds. Your signature confirms that you can access Rose's inheritance money and begin monthly payments immediately. The contract he slid across the table was surprisingly detailed, complete with penalty clauses for missed payments and legal language that would give him authority to pursue collection if family members failed to meet their obligations. He'd spent considerable time and possibly professional consultation creating what amounted to indentured servitude disguised as family cooperation. I opened my briefcase slowly, removing the folder Jennifer had prepared, along with several additional documents that would fundamentally alter the evening's direction. Daniel, before I sign anything, I think there are some things about my financial situation that you should understand. His expression showed barely concealed irritation at what he perceived as continued delay tactics. Maya, your financial situation isn't complicated. You're a nurse with modest expenses who inherited some money from Rose. This isn't rocket science. You're absolutely right, I agreed, placing Jennifer's portfolio summary on the table. It's not rocket science, it's investment science, and apparently I've been better at it than you realized. The document that landed between Daniel's carefully prepared contracts bore the letterhead of Walsh Financial Management, along with account summaries that made his BMW payment look like pocket change. His eyes scanned the first page with growing confusion, trying to process numbers that didn't align with his assumptions about my financial capacity. This says, he stopped, then recalculated, then looked up with genuine bewilderment. This says you have over $1 million in investments. Christina leaned forward to read over his shoulder, her tablet forgotten as she tried to comprehend the portfolio details that Jennifer had meticulously documented. My mother moved closer, squinting at numbers that seemed to exist in a different mathematical universe than the family finances she understood. Actually, it's $1.2 million as of yesterday's market close, I corrected gently.
Plus the rental properties, which generate about $4,000 monthly in passive income. That's before we factor in the stock dividends and bond interest. The silence that followed was profound, the kind of quiet that occurs when fundamental assumptions about reality suddenly prove false. Daniel's face cycled through expressions of disbelief, calculation, and dawning comprehension that his little sister possessed financial resources that dwarfed his own. "But you drive that old Honda," Christina whispered, as if my car choice somehow negated the documentation spread before them. "Because it's reliable and paid for," I replied. "Aunt Rose taught me that real wealth whispers while poverty shouts. Apparently, I learned that lesson better than anyone realized."
Daniel's hands shook slightly as he turned pages in Jennifer's report, discovering rental properties I'd purchased, stock options that had vested, cryptocurrency investments that had multiplied beyond anyone's expectations. Each page revealed another layer of financial sophistication that contradicted everything he'd believed about my capabilities and circumstances. Rose left you 50,000, my mother said weakly, clinging to the last piece of information that still made sense in her understanding of family finances. Rose left me $50,000 and 40 years of investment education, I corrected. She taught me about compound interest, market research, and the importance of patience in building long-term wealth. More importantly, she taught me to recognize opportunities that other people overlook because they're too busy making assumptions. Daniel's hands shook slightly as he turned pages in Jennifer's report, discovering rental properties I'd purchased, stock options that had vested, cryptocurrency investments that had multiplied beyond anyone's expectations. Each page revealed another layer of financial sophistication that contradicted everything he'd believed about my capabilities and circumstances. Rose left you 50,000, my mother said weakly, clinging to the last piece of information that still made sense in her understanding of family finances. Rose left me $50,000 and 40 years of investment education, I corrected. She taught me about compound interest, market research, and the importance of patience in building long-term wealth. More importantly, she taught me to recognize opportunities that other people overlook because they're too busy making assumptions. The transformation in Daniel's demeanor was striking to witness. The confident authority he'd wielded so effectively just moments earlier crumbled as he processed the reality that his financially irresponsible sister was actually wealthier than everyone in the room combined. "Why didn't you tell us?" The question came out as an accusation rather than genuine curiosity. "Tell you what? That I'd been successful with investments? When would that conversation have happened? During the family dinners where you explained why nursing wasn't a real career? Or maybe during the holiday gatherings where Christina joked about my empty life and lack of real responsibilities?" I pulled out another document from my briefcase, this one showing the substantial contributions I'd been making to Dad's care since his stroke began. I've been covering his prescription costs and physical therapy copays for 6 months. That's about $1,200 monthly that I've been handling quietly because I didn't want to embarrass anyone by making it obvious that I could afford what others couldn't. The revelation hit Daniel like a physical blow. Not only had he misjudged my financial capacity, but I'd been providing support that exceeded his own contributions while allowing him to maintain his self-image as the responsible family leader. Christina stared at the documentation with growing horror as she realized the implications for their own financial narrative. "But Daniel makes excellent money in pharmaceutical sales. We have the house in Willowbrook Estates." "Which you're underwater on because you bought at the market peak with an adjustable rate mortgage," I said gently. "I researched comparable properties when you were house hunting. You're paying about 40% more than current market value, and your monthly payments consume nearly 60% of Daniel's gross income." The accuracy of my assessment was evident in Daniel's face, which had gone pale as he processed the reality that I'd been quietly monitoring and understanding his financial decisions better than he understood mine. "I also know about the credit card debt you've been accumulating to maintain your lifestyle, the car lease that's stretching your budget beyond sustainability, and the private school tuition that's preventing you from building any meaningful savings. You're living paycheck to paycheck while projecting an image of success, which is exactly the opposite of how I've chosen to live." My mother sank into her chair as the full scope of the evening's revelations settled over our family dinner table. Her son, whom she'd always considered the financial success story, was actually struggling to maintain an unsustainable lifestyle. Her daughter, whom she'd pitied for her modest choices and unmarried state, was approaching genuine wealth through careful planning and disciplined execution. Daniel's hands clenched into fists as he struggled to process the complete inversion of everything he'd believed about our relative positions in life. "So what? You've just been sitting there letting us assume you needed our help? Letting me lecture you about financial responsibility while you had more money than all of us?" "I've been protecting your ego while quietly ensuring Dad received the care he needed," I replied.
But last night, when you handed me a contract demanding access to Rose's inheritance and treating me like a financial dependent who needed your guidance, you crossed a line. I reached into my briefcase one final time, producing a printed email from the care facility Daniel had selected. I spoke with the facility director this morning. There's no other family competing for Dad's room, no artificial deadline for placement, and no emergency requiring immediate family contracts. You fabricated the urgency to pressure me into signing your agreement. The manipulation exposed, Daniel's carefully constructed authority collapsed entirely. Christina looked between her husband and the documents that proved their entire understanding of family finances had been fundamentally wrong. I've also researched the facility you selected, I continued. It's the most expensive option available, with amenities that have nothing to do with medical care quality. I've arranged Dad's transfer to Sunset Manor, which provides identical medical services at 40% lower cost. The monthly fees will be covered entirely by my rental income, with no family contributions required from anyone. My mother began crying softly, overwhelmed by the revelation that her daughter had not only been secretly wealthy, but had quietly solved the crisis that had been consuming the entire family's attention. "You can't just make decisions for everyone," Daniel protested weakly, his voice lacking the conviction that had carried him through previous confrontations. "I'm not making decisions for everyone," I replied, standing and gathering my documents. "I'm making decisions for myself and Dad's care. You're free to continue living however you choose, but the family ATM is officially closed. No more assumptions about my finances, no more lectures about responsibility, and definitely no more contracts attempting to access money that was never yours to claim." I picked up Daniel's unsigned agreement and placed it in my briefcase alongside Jennifer's portfolio reports. For the record, the $800 monthly you demanded represents less than what my investments generate in passive income every week. You weren't asking me to sacrifice for family. You were asking me to subsidize your poor financial planning. The drive home felt different than any I'd taken from my parents' house, as if the weight of years of misunderstood dynamics had finally lifted from my shoulders. My phone remained silent, no desperate texts or manipulative calls following my departure. The silence spoke volumes about how thoroughly the evening had shifted our family's power structure.
Mr. Whiskers greeted me with his usual indifference, more interested in his evening routine than the financial earthquake that had just reshaped my family relationships. I poured myself a glass of wine, the good bottle I'd been saving, and settled into my reading chair with a sense of completion I hadn't felt in years. Aunt Rose's voice echoed in my memory as I raised my glass to her photograph on the mantelpiece. "Never let them know everything, Maya. A woman's greatest power is in what she keeps private." Tonight, I'd chosen to reveal my hand, and the game had ended exactly as she taught me it would. The house was quiet, but it wasn't lonely. It was peaceful. 3 weeks passed in blissful silence before Daniel finally called. I was reviewing quarterly reports from my rental properties when his name appeared on my phone screen, and for a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. The old Maya would have answered immediately, apologizing for whatever inconvenience my existence might have caused. The new Maya, secure in her financial independence and free from family manipulation, had the luxury of choice. "Maya?" His voice carried none of the commanding authority that had characterized our previous conversations. "We need to talk." I set down my coffee and walked to the window overlooking my small garden, where autumn had painted the maple tree in shades of gold that reminded me of Aunt Rose's favorite earrings. "What can I do for you, Daniel?" The question hung between us, weighted with implications that we both understood. For the first time in our adult relationship, he was calling to ask rather than demand, to request rather than instruct. "Dad's been at Sunset Manor for 2 weeks now," he began carefully. "The staff says he's adjusting well to the new environment." I waited, knowing there was more to come. Daniel had never called simply to provide updates on Dad's well-being without an ulterior motive lurking beneath the surface conversation. "The thing is," he continued, his voice dropping to the tone he'd once used when asking to borrow my car in high school, "Christina and I have been having some financial discussions, and we realize we might have misunderstood some things about your situation." The understatement was breathtaking in its scope. They hadn't misunderstood my situation, they'd constructed an elaborate fantasy about my limitations that served their need to feel superior while justifying their demands for financial support.
What kind of discussions? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the direction this conversation would take. Daniel cleared his throat nervously. Well, we've been looking at our budget more carefully, and it turns out we're not in as strong a position as we thought. The private school tuition is really stretching us thin, and the mortgage adjustment is coming up next year. The admission represented a complete reversal from his previous claims about financial stability and responsible family leadership. Just 3 weeks ago, he'd been lecturing me about basic mathematics and adult responsibilities while presenting himself as the model of fiscal responsibility. I see, I replied, neutrally, offering no commentary or judgment that might derail his obviously difficult confession. The thing is, Daniel continued, his words coming faster now as if speed might somehow reduce their impact, we were wondering if you might consider some kind of family loan arrangement. Nothing formal or complicated, just temporary assistance until we can restructure some things. The request was remarkable for its audacity. After years of treating me like a financial dependent who needed guidance on basic budgeting, after fabricating emergencies to manipulate me into signing contracts, after dismissing my career and lifestyle choices as inadequate compared to their sophisticated success, Daniel was now asking me for money. How much are we talking about? I asked, curious to see how far his desperation extended. Maybe $20,000 to start, just to get us through the mortgage situation and cover some immediate expenses. We could pay you back monthly, with interest of course, better than what you'd get from a bank. The assumption that I needed investment advice from someone who was drowning in debt while maintaining appearances was perfectly consistent with Daniel's inability to grasp the reality of our reversed positions. He was offering to pay me interest rates better than banks, while apparently unaware that my current investment portfolio was generating returns that made his proposed arrangement laughably inadequate. $20,000, I repeated thoughtfully. That's interesting timing, considering you spent last month explaining why I should contribute $800 monthly to Dad's care because I had no significant financial obligations. The silence on Daniel's end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone forced to confront the complete collapse of his previous worldview. I agree, I replied. Why don't you and Christina come over this evening? We can discuss your situation properly. The invitation was deliberately framed as a business meeting rather than a family gathering, establishing the tone for what would undoubtedly be a very different kind of conversation than we'd ever had before. They arrived at 7 o'clock, Daniel's BMW looking somehow less impressive in my driveway than it had at our parents' house. Christina wore the kind of carefully casual outfit that suggested she'd spent considerable time selecting clothes that would project both respect and relatability, trying to strike the perfect balance for approaching a family member they now needed to treat as a potential creditor. I led them into my living room, noting how their eyes lingered on details they'd never bothered to notice during previous visits. The original artwork on my walls wasn't expensive, but it was carefully chosen and professionally framed. The furniture was modest but high quality, selected for comfort and durability rather than status. Even my sound system, quietly playing jazz standards, reflected the preferences of someone who valued substance over flash. "Your house is really lovely," Christina said, her tone suggesting this was the first time she'd actually looked at my living space rather than mentally cataloging its deficiencies compared to their Willowbrook Estates McMansion. "Thank you. I've always preferred investing in experiences and quality over appearances." We settled into my comfortable chairs with coffee and the kind of pastries I'd learned to make during the quiet evenings that my family had always pitied as empty and lonely. The irony wasn't lost on me that my supposedly barren social life had provided time for developing wealth, building contentment that my married brother was desperately seeking to borrow.
Daniel began with what was clearly a rehearsed speech about family relationships and mutual support, about how the recent revelations had helped him understand that they'd all made some incorrect assumptions about my circumstances. The apology was careful and calculated, designed to acknowledge error without accepting full responsibility for years of condescension and manipulation. "The truth is," he concluded, "we could really use some guidance on financial management. You obviously know things about investing and budgeting that we never learned." The request for guidance was particularly rich, coming from someone who'd spent our entire adult relationship explaining why my financial choices were naive and my understanding of money was fundamentally limited. Now he wanted access to the expertise he'd dismissed as irrelevant just weeks earlier. Before we discuss any potential arrangements, I said carefully, I think we need to address some underlying issues about respect and communication. I pulled out a folder I'd prepared containing printouts of text messages, email exchanges, and notes from family conversations that documented years of financial manipulation and emotional pressure. The evidence was methodically organized, presenting a clear pattern of behavior that went far beyond simple misunderstandings about my economic situation. This represents 3 years of demands, guilt trips, and assumptions about my obligations to subsidize decisions I was never consulted about, I explained, spreading the documents across my coffee table. Before I consider any new financial arrangements, I need to understand what's changed beyond your discovery that I have money. Daniel and Christina reviewed the documentation in uncomfortable silence, confronted with the written record of behavior they'd probably never considered from my perspective. Seeing their own words reflected back in black and white, the pattern of manipulation became impossible to deny or rationalize. Maya, we had no idea, Christina whispered, though her statement rang hollow given the deliberate nature of many of the documented exchanges. The question isn't whether you knew, I replied. The question is whether you're prepared to fundamentally change how we interact going forward. I outlined my conditions for any future family financial discussions. All requests would be presented in writing with complete documentation of need and proposed repayment terms. No more artificial deadlines or manufactured emergencies designed to prevent careful consideration. No more assumptions about my obligations or automatic expectations of support for lifestyle choices I hadn't participated in making. Most importantly, I continued, no more lectures about financial responsibility from people who are drowning in debt while maintaining appearances. If you want access to my resources, you need to respect my expertise. The terms were fair but firm, establishing boundaries that protected me from future manipulation while offering genuine assistance to family members who approached me with honesty and respect. Daniel struggled visibly with the role reversal that placed him in the position of supplicant rather than advisor. These conditions seem pretty formal for family relationships. Family relationships require trust, I replied. Trust that's been damaged by years of treating me like an ATM rather than a person with valuable insights and legitimate feelings. We spent the next 2 hours reviewing their actual financial situation, which was even worse than I'd suspected. The combination of lifestyle inflation, poor credit decisions, and complete absence of emergency savings had created a precarious situation that required immediate intervention to prevent complete collapse. Working through their budget was like performing financial triage, identifying which expenses were essential and which represented vanity spending that needed immediate elimination. The private school tuition that consumed nearly 30% of their income provided prestige but no educational advantages over excellent public schools in their district. The BMW lease payment that Daniel considered essential to his professional image was actually undermining his financial stability. The fundamental problem, explained, is that you've been spending like people who earn twice your actual income. Every financial decision has been based on the lifestyle you wanted rather than the resources you actually possessed. By the end of the evening, we'd developed a comprehensive plan that would allow them to stabilize their finances without requiring massive infusions of external support. The plan demanded significant lifestyle adjustments and wounded pride, but it offered a sustainable path forward that didn't depend on continued family subsidies. I agreed to provide a bridge loan to handle their immediate mortgage crisis, but with terms that reflected market rates and formal documentation that protected everyone involved. More importantly, I established ongoing financial counseling sessions that would help them develop the skills necessary to avoid future crises. As they prepared to leave, Daniel paused at my front door with an expression I'd never seen before, something that might have been genuine respect mixed with residual bewilderment about how completely he'd misjudged his sister's capabilities. "Maya, I owe you an apology that goes way beyond tonight's conversation," he said quietly. "I spent years treating you like you didn't understand things that you actually understood better than anyone." The acknowledgement was more valuable than any financial arrangement we might negotiate.
For the first time in our adult relationship, Daniel was seeing me as a competent individual whose insights deserved consideration rather than as a supporting character in his personal drama. Over the following months, our family dynamics shifted in ways that felt both revolutionary and inevitable. My parents gradually adjusted to having a daughter whose financial acumen exceeded their son's, though my mother still occasionally slipped into old patterns of worry about my unmarried state and modest lifestyle choices. Dad's recovery at Sunset Manor progressed better than anyone had hoped, aided by medical care that focused on rehabilitation rather than luxury amenities. He often commented on how peaceful the environment felt compared to the stress that had surrounded discussions of his placement, not knowing that the peace came from removing financial pressure from family relationships. My work at Riverside General took on new dimensions as my investment in the medical center's expansion plans positioned me as a stakeholder rather than just an employee. The executive meetings I attended featured discussions about strategic growth and market opportunities that would have been impossible to appreciate without Aunt Rose's patient education about business fundamentals. Jennifer Walsh and I continued our quarterly meetings, but now focused on philanthropic planning rather than basic wealth accumulation. Having achieved financial security beyond anything I'd imagined possible, the conversations turned toward creating lasting impact through careful charitable giving and community investment. The townhouse that had once represented modest contentment became the foundation for a life deliberately chosen rather than simply accepted. Mr. Whiskers continued his dignified rule over our quiet domain, indifferent to portfolio statements and investment returns, but deeply appreciative of the stability that financial independence provided. On quiet Sunday mornings, I would sit in Aunt Rose's rocking chair that I'd moved to my bedroom, reviewing the week's financial reports while planning the day ahead. The routine connected me to her memory while reminding me of the patient discipline that had transformed her modest inheritance into genuine wealth. Sometimes Daniel would call with questions about investment strategies or budget planning, approaching me with the respect he might have shown a professional consultant rather than the dismissive condescension that had characterized our previous interactions. The transformation in our relationship wasn't perfect, but it was authentic in ways that our previous dynamic had never been. The greatest gift wasn't the money itself, but the freedom to choose how I spent my time and energy without regard for others' expectations or demands. Financial independence had revealed that my contentment with single life wasn't settling for less, but rather choosing differently than people who confused complexity with success. Late autumn evenings found me reading investment journals by the fireplace, planning travel that would combine personal interests with educational opportunities, and considering graduate programs that would enhance my professional expertise rather than simply increase my earning potential. The girl who had once apologized for existing independently had become a woman who celebrated the choices that others had pitied. Aunt Rose's voice still echoed in my quieter moments, reminding me that true wealth lie not in what others can see, but in what you chose to keep private until the moment you decided to change everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.